can't be back here. This area is for medical staff only.
I am medical staff.
I need to see some identification.
You need to see my ID to believe I work here?
Yes, like everyone does.
Interesting. I've watched you let 4 people pass through this hallway in the last 2 minutes. None of them were wearing visible ID badges. You didn't stop any of them.
At exactly 6:15 a.m. on a Wednesday morning at St. Catherine's Medical Center in Baltimore, a security guard named Blake Mercer made the worst decision of his professional life. He stopped a black woman in scrubs and demanded to see her identification. What he didn't know was that the woman in front of him wasn't just a doctor. She was Dr. Alicia Hammond, chief medical officer, board member, and the person who literally signed his paychecks. The security camera footage would be reviewed by the hospital board, employment attorneys, and eventually become required viewing for every security company operating in medical facilities across 3 states. In 12 minutes, Blake's career would be over. In 6 months, the hospital would pay $850,000 to settle a discrimination lawsuit. And in 1 year, security protocols at 17 hospitals would be completely rewritten because of what was about to happen. But in that moment, standing in the corridor near the ICU entrance, Blake had no idea. He just knew he didn't like the attitude of this woman who was questioning his authority. He was about to learn that some people have attitudes because they're tired of being treated like criminals in their own workplace. Before we continue, I need you to do something. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And please, hit that subscribe button right now. This story gets absolutely wild, and you're going to want to see how it ends. Dr. Alicia Hammond was not your average 44-year-old doctor. While most physicians her age were focused on their specialty practice or maybe climbing to department head, Alicia was running an entire hospital's medical operations. But here's what made her truly exceptional. She wasn't just a talented administrator who worked her way up. Alicia was a Harvard-trained cardiothoracic surgeon who had performed over 3,000 open heart surgeries before moving into hospital leadership. She held 2 master's degrees, one in public health and one in business administration. She had been published in the New England Journal of Medicine 17 times. Her research on reducing surgical complications in minority patients had changed protocols at hospitals nationwide. As chief medical officer, Alicia oversaw every clinical department, every medical decision, every doctor, nurse, and medical staff member in a hospital that treated over 150,000 patients per year. She was responsible for a medical staff of 800 physicians and a clinical budget of $340 million. The hospital board reported to her on medical matters. The CEO consulted her on strategic decisions. She was, by any measure, one of the most powerful people in that building. She was also one of only 12 black female chief medical officers at major hospitals in the entire United States. And she had spent her entire career dealing with people who assumed she was in the wrong place. On this particular Wednesday, Alicia had been at the hospital since 4:30 a.m. There had been a multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 95. 7 trauma patients had come in simultaneously. Alicia had been in the trauma bay coordinating care, directing the surgical teams, making the critical decisions that saved lives. She was still in her scrubs. They had blood on them. Her surgical cap was pulled back. Her badge was clipped to her waistband, partially covered by the scrub top. She was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, and she was heading to the ICU to check on the patients they had just saved. She had walked this hallway thousands of times. She knew every nurse, most of the cleaning staff, and certainly every security guard who worked the day shift. Or so she thought. Blake Mercer was new. He had been hired 3 weeks earlier by the hospital's contract security company. He had minimal training, a 2-day orientation that mostly covered where to stand and when to take breaks. Nobody had told him about the hospital leadership. Nobody had shown him pictures of the chief medical officer. Nobody had explained that doctors in scrubs don't always have their badges visible, especially when they've been in surgery. What Blake did have was assumptions. He had assumptions about what doctors looked like. He had assumptions about who belonged in restricted areas and who didn't. And when he saw Alicia walking down that corridor, every single one of his assumptions told him she didn't belong there. He called out to her, said she couldn't be back there. That area was for medical staff only. Alicia stopped. She turned. She was used to this. It happened at medical conferences. It happened at professional events. It happened in her own hospital more often than anyone should have to tolerate. She told him simply that she was medical staff. Her tone was neutral, not friendly, not hostile, just stating a fact. Blake demanded identification, not asked, demanded. Alicia asked him a question instead of immediately complying. She asked if he needed to see her ID to believe she worked there. It was a pointed question. Because the implication was clear. Why would he question whether she worked there? What made him assume she didn't belong? Blake fell back on policy, said hospital policy required everyone to display proper identification in restricted areas. It was a reasonable sounding justification, except for one problem. It wasn't being applied consistently. Alicia pointed this out. She had watched him let 4 people pass through that hallway in the last 2 minutes. None of them were wearing visible ID badges. He hadn't stopped any of them. She asked what made her different from the others who had just walked past. Quick question for you watching. Have you ever been treated like you don't belong somewhere you absolutely have the right to be? Type yes or no in the comments. Blake didn't answer the question. Instead, he escalated. He asked if she was refusing to show identification, trying to make her the problem, trying to make her refusal to immediately comply the issue rather than his selective enforcement of the rules. Alicia kept her cool. She asked why she was the only one being stopped. What made her different from the others? The question hung in the air. Everyone watching this encounter knew the answer. Everyone except Blake, apparently. Blake made his next mistake. He said he didn't have time for this. He told her to show ID or he would call for backup and have her escorted out. It was a threat, meant to intimidate, meant to force compliance through fear of embarrassment or worse. That's when Alicia dropped the bomb. She told him to call his backup, to call his supervisor, to call HR, because in about 5 minutes, he was going to realize he had just demanded ID from the chief medical officer of the entire hospital. The words landed like a physical blow. You could see it in Blake's face in the security footage. The confidence drained away, replaced by uncertainty, then fear. He tried to recover, said something about how he couldn't be expected to believe that. His tone had changed though. The authority was gone. Alicia didn't back down. She said she didn't expect him to believe anything. She expected him to do his job properly, which included not racially profiling the doctors who worked there. She said it clearly, directly, racially profiling, not implying it, not dancing around it, naming it exactly. A nurse appeared from one of the patient rooms. She saw Alicia and started to say good morning. Then she saw Blake and stopped. She looked confused. The nurse's name was Jennifer, and she had worked with Alicia for 6 years. She knew exactly who Alicia was. Jennifer asked if everything was okay. Alicia said it was fine, but that the security guard had stopped her and demanded her identification because apparently she didn't look like she belonged in the medical staff area. Jennifer's jaw dropped. She looked at Blake and said, "You stopped Dr. Hammond?" The name clearly meant nothing to Blake. He asked who Dr. Hammond was. Jennifer just stared at him. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She said, "She's the chief medical officer. She runs this entire hospital." Blake's face went white, actually white. You could see it in the security footage. The color just drained out. He started to stammer an apology. Alicia cut him off. She asked for his name and his supervisor's contact information. Blake gave it, his voice shaking now. Alicia pulled out her phone. She called someone. When they answered, she said, "Tom, it's Alicia. I need you to come to the 3rd floor ICU corridor right now. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." Tom was Tom Henderson, the hospital's chief security officer. He had been with St. Catherine's for 12 years. He arrived within 3 minutes. He took one look at the scene, Alicia in bloody scrubs with her arms crossed, Blake looking terrified, Jennifer standing there as a witness, and he immediately knew this was bad. Alicia explained what happened, calmly, factually. She said Blake had stopped her in the corridor, demanded her identification, and threatened to have her escorted out when she questioned why she was the only person being stopped. She pointed out that he had let multiple people without visible badges pass without questioning them. She said the only explanation for the selective enforcement was racial profiling. Tom turned to Blake and asked if this was accurate. Blake tried to explain. He said he was just doing his job, enforcing the badge policy. Tom asked if he had stopped anyone else in that corridor. Blake hesitated, then admitted he hadn't. Tom asked why not. Blake said he didn't have a good answer. Tom told Blake to return to the security office and wait there. Blake left, and you could see in the footage that he knew his job was over. He walked away with his shoulders slumped, no longer the confident authority figure from 10 minutes earlier. Tom apologized to Alicia, not just a quick sorry, a real apology. He said this was unacceptable and would be addressed immediately. Alicia said this wasn't just about her. She had dealt with this kind of thing her entire career, but she couldn't have it happening in her own hospital. Not to her, not to other doctors of color, not to anyone. She told Tom she wanted a full review of the security contractor's training procedures. She wanted data on who was being stopped and questioned in restricted areas. She wanted to know if there was a pattern, and she wanted it all within 48 hours. Tom nodded. He understood. This wasn't a request from a doctor who had been inconvenienced. This was a directive from a C-suite executive who had just been discriminated against in her own facility. The implications were massive. Do you think the hospital acted quickly enough? Let me know what you think in the comments. Alicia went to check on her patients. She had 5 people in the ICU who needed her attention. People who didn't care about badge policies or security protocols. People who just needed a doctor who knew how to save their lives. She pushed the incident aside and did her job. But she didn't forget. That evening, after a 16-hour shift, Alicia sat down and wrote a detailed account of what happened. Every word spoken, every person who witnessed it, the timestamps, the location, the specific discriminatory aspects of the encounter. She sent the account to Tom Henderson. She also sent it to the hospital CEO, the HR director, the board chair, and her attorney. She wasn't just filing an internal complaint. She was creating a documented record with multiple witnesses and stakeholders. The next morning, Tom delivered his report. It wasn't good. Over the previous 3 weeks, Blake had stopped 12 people in restricted areas and demanded identification. 11 of them were people of color, 8 were women of color. Only 1 was a white person, and that was a young white man with long hair and tattoos. The pattern was undeniable. Blake wasn't enforcing hospital policy. He was enforcing his own biases about what medical staff should look like. Tom had already terminated Blake's access to the facility and notified the security contractor that Blake was not to return. But Alicia wasn't satisfied with just firing Blake. She wanted systemic change. She called a meeting with the CEO, the board chair, the head of HR, and the security contractor's regional manager. In that meeting, she presented data she had personally requested from IT. Over the past year, security stops in restricted areas showed a clear racial disparity. Black and Latino staff were stopped and questioned at rates 3 times higher than white staff, even though they made up only 35% of the medical staff. The data was damning. It showed this wasn't just Blake, it was a broader problem. The security contractor tried to defend their training protocols. Alicia shut that down immediately. She said if their training was producing guards who couldn't recognize the hospital's chief medical officer and who selectively enforced policies based on race, then their training was worthless. She gave them 2 options. Completely overhaul their training program with input from the hospital's diversity and inclusion team, plus implement mandatory implicit bias training, plus create clear protocols for identifying staff without visible badges, plus submit to quarterly audits of their stop data, or they could lose the contract. The contractor chose option 1. They couldn't afford to lose a major hospital contract. Within 2 weeks, they had developed a new training program. Every guard was required to complete 8 hours of implicit bias training. They were given photo directories of all hospital leadership. They were trained on how to politely verify someone's role without making assumptions based on appearance. But that wasn't the end of the story. Alicia had spoken with her attorney about the incident. The attorney pointed out that while Blake had been fired and training had been improved, the hospital itself bore responsibility for the discriminatory environment. The contractor worked for the hospital had oversight responsibility. Alicia didn't want to sue her own hospital, but she also knew that without financial consequences, institutions rarely take these issues seriously enough. She filed a formal EEOC complaint alleging racial discrimination and hostile work environment. She documented not just this incident with Blake, but a pattern of similar incidents over her 5 years as CMO. Times when security had questioned her presence in leadership meetings. Times when she had been mistaken for housekeeping or dietary staff. Times when her authority had been challenged in ways her white male colleagues never experienced. All documented, all witnesses, all recorded in emails and incident reports she had filed with HR. The hospital's attorneys reviewed the complaint and knew they had a problem. Alicia wasn't some entry-level employee they could dismiss. She was the chief medical officer. She had an impeccable reputation. She had documentation. And if this went to court, the jury would see security camera footage of a black female doctor in bloody scrubs being threatened with removal from her own hospital. The settlement negotiations were relatively quick. The hospital didn't want this in the news. They didn't want other hospitals to see them as a place that discriminated against their own leadership. They didn't want doctors of color to be reluctant to accept positions there. 6 months after the incident, they reached a settlement, $850,000 paid to Alicia. But more importantly, the hospital agreed to comprehensive policy changes. They created a chief diversity officer position reporting directly to the CEO. They implemented mandatory bias training for all staff. not just security. They established an independent review board to investigate discrimination complaints. They committed to recruiting more diverse leadership and tracking demographic data at all levels. Alicia used a portion of her settlement to establish a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing careers in hospital administration. She wanted to make sure the next generation of healthcare leaders would be more diverse. So eventually, people wouldn't assume that Black women in hospitals must be anything other than the accomplished professionals they are. Blake never worked in security again. His termination for discrimination made it nearly impossible to get hired elsewhere. The security contractor used his case in their training as an example of exactly what not to do. His 12-minute encounter became a cautionary tale. But here's what's important to understand. Blake was just one person, but he represented a much larger problem. The security contractor had hired him without proper training. The hospital had contracted with a company that didn't prioritize identifying their own staff. The system had allowed this to happen. And it wasn't just affecting Alicia. How many nurses of color had been stopped and questioned? How many technicians? How many doctors who weren't in leadership positions and didn't have the power to fight back? The data showed hundreds of instances over just 1 year. That's what Alicia meant when she said this wasn't just about her. This was about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of race, could do their jobs without being treated like they didn't belong. Let's talk about what this story really teaches us. On the surface, this is about a security guard who racially profiled his boss and paid the price. But if that's all you take from this, you're missing the bigger picture. First lesson, documentation matters. Alicia didn't just complain verbally. She wrote detailed accounts. She requested data, she compiled evidence, she created a record that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Without documentation, this becomes one person's word against another's. With documentation, it becomes undeniable facts. Second lesson, patterns matter more than incidents. One security guard stopping one doctor could be explained away as a misunderstanding, but data showing hundreds of discriminatory stops over a year, that's a system failure. That requires systemic solutions. Alicia understood that fixing the system was more important than punishing one individual. Third lesson, know your power and use it strategically. Alicia had positional power as CMO. She used it. But she didn't just get Blake fired and move on. She leveraged her position to force institutional change. She made sure the solution was bigger than just removing one bad actor. Fourth lesson, financial consequences drive change. The hospital paid $850,000. That got the board's attention. That made them take the issue seriously. That made them invest in real solutions. Sad but true. Institutions often don't change until it costs them money. Fifth lesson, create opportunities for others. Alicia could have just taken her settlement and moved on. Instead, she used it to create a scholarship fund. She turned her negative experience into something that would help the next generation. That's how individual incidents become lasting change. Have you or someone you know experienced discrimination at work? Share your story in the comments if you're comfortable. The security footage from that morning was never released publicly per the settlement agreement, but it was used in training programs. Security companies across the healthcare industry used it as an example. New guards watch it and learn what happens when you make assumptions based on race rather than following proper procedures. The footage shows something important. Alicia never raised her voice. She never became angry or aggressive. She asked questions. She pointed out inconsistencies. She asserted her authority when necessary. Her professionalism throughout the encounter made it impossible for anyone to claim she was being difficult or unreasonable. That's not to say people should have to be perfect victims, but it does show the power of staying calm and documenting everything. When you can point to video footage showing you being polite while being discriminated against, it's a lot harder for people to dismiss your complaint. 3 years after the incident, St. Catherine's Medical Center had made significant progress. Their leadership team was more diverse, their policies were clearer, their training was better, complaints of discriminatory treatment had dropped by 60%. They had been recognized by several healthcare organizations for their commitment to diversity and inclusion. But Alicia would tell you the work wasn't finished. Progress doesn't mean perfection. There were still incidents, still complaints, still work to be done, but the system was better than it had been. And that mattered. Blake's story took a different turn. After being fired from security work, he struggled for a while. Eventually, he got a job in retail. About a year after the incident, he reached out to Alicia through LinkedIn. He sent her a message apologizing for what happened. He said he had done a lot of thinking about his own biases. He said he was working on becoming a better person. Alicia never responded to the message. She told colleagues later that she appreciated the apology, but she didn't owe Blake her forgiveness or her time. Her energy was better spent on systemic change than on individual redemption stories. Some people disagreed with that choice. They thought grace and forgiveness were important, but Alicia's point was valid. Black women spend enough time managing other people's feelings. Sometimes the right thing to do is focus on yourself and your community. The security contractor lost 2 other hospital contracts in the year following the incident. Word spread in the healthcare industry. Hospitals didn't want to risk similar situations. The contractor eventually went out of business. A new company took over their accounts, and that company made diversity training and proper staff identification their top priorities. That's the ripple effect of accountability. One incident, handled properly, can change an entire industry's approach to a problem, but only if the person being discriminated against has the resources, knowledge, and determination to push for real change, and only if institutions are willing to take the issue seriously. Alicia still works at St. Catherine's. She's now being considered for a CEO position at a larger hospital system. Her reputation in healthcare leadership has only grown. She's frequently invited to speak at conferences about diversity in healthcare, about leadership, about creating inclusive environments in medical settings. In these talks, she always mentions that morning with Blake, not because it was the worst thing that ever happened to her, it wasn't, but because it was so perfectly representative of what many professionals of color experience every day. The assumptions, the extra scrutiny, the burden of proving you belong in spaces where you have every right to be. She tells audiences that the goal isn't to punish every Blake in the world. The goal is to create systems where Blake's assumptions don't turn into discriminatory actions, where proper training and clear protocols prevent bias from affecting how people are treated, where diversity isn't just a buzzword but a lived reality at every level of an organization. Final question for you watching. If you were in Alicia's position, would you have filed the lawsuit or tried to handle it internally? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Here's the thing about this story that makes it both frustrating and hopeful. Frustrating because Alicia had to go through this, because she had to spend her time and energy fighting discrimination in addition to doing her actual job, which was running the medical operations of an entire hospital. Because she had to document and prove and fight for what should have been obvious, that she belonged there. But hopeful because she won. Because the system, while imperfect, did eventually respond. Because one person with knowledge, documentation, and determination was able to force institutional change. Because other people in similar situations now have better policies protecting them. That's the balance we have to hold. Acknowledging that the system is broken while also recognizing that it can be fixed. Understanding that individuals shouldn't have to be heroes, to be treated fairly, while also celebrating those who fight back when they're not. The hallway outside the ICU at St. Catherine's looks the same as it did that Wednesday morning. The same walls, the same lighting, the same nurses station. But something fundamental changed there. A clear message was sent. You can't make assumptions about who belongs based on what they look like. You can't selectively enforce rules based on race. And if you do, there will be consequences. Blake learned that lesson the hard way, the security contractor learned it, the hospital learned it, and hopefully everyone watching this video is learning it too. Rights only matter when people are willing to stand up for them. Policies only work when people are willing to enforce them fairly. Change only happens when people are willing to fight for it. Thanks for watching this story all the way through. If you found this valuable, if it taught you something or made you think differently, please subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories because they matter, because knowledge is power, because accountability is necessary, because change is possible when people refuse to accept discrimination. Hit that subscribe button, share this video, drop a comment about what you learned, and remember, if you're ever treated like you don't belong somewhere you have every right to be, you have options. Document everything. Know your rights. Follow through. And don't be afraid to make people face the consequences of their discriminatory actions. That's not being difficult. That's demanding the basic respect that every human being deserves. That's how we create workplaces and societies where people are judged by their qualifications and their character, not by assumptions based on their appearance. See you in the next one.